Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. I'd like to introduce myself and welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on facilitating the growth of restorative justice. This webinar is one in a series of webinars addressing topics aligned with the School of Professional Studies Masters of Science program in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. My name is Ileana Espia, an admissions counselor in the School of Professional Studies, and I will be facilitating some of our conversations today. If you're able to hear me, please type yes into the Q&A box. We want to make sure that we can all hear our presenters loud and clear before we dive in. Awesome. I encourage you all to utilize the Q&A function as you develop questions during the presentation. At the end of today's session, we will be addressing some of the questions you share with us today. We will not be using the chat box function for this webinar, so please let us know of any questions via the Q&A box. I would also like to share with the group that today's session is being recorded and will be made available to you for your convenience afterwards. At this time, I would like to welcome today's presenter. Joining us today is Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida, Academic Director for the MS in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program. Along with Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida, we have Dr. Greg Paul, Associate Professor and Department Head at Kansas State University. Hi, Beth. How are you doing today?
Fine. Thank you, Ileana. And thank you, Greg, for joining us today. So I guess we can go to the next slide. And I wanted to set the context for today's webinar by talking a little bit about justice, and then the flip side would be injustice and the perceptions of such. So according to Morten Deutsch, who was a preeminent social psychologist, Morten framed 6 different types of justice. So the first is distributive justice. When we think about distributive justice, we can think about distribution of resources, access to resources, and the perceptions of equality or equity. And also, perceptions are a person's reality. So whether resources are distributed equally, fairly, or not, it also is the perception of how they're distributed and access to resources that also gets involved in the whole concept of distributive justice or injustice. The second is procedural, and that really is not only about the outcomes, but the procedures in place to arrive at outcomes. And some people feel the deck is stacked against them, so to speak, that the procedural justice is not justice and that there actually is some injustice there. Then the whole sense of injustice, and some feel injustice towards themselves, and others, typically people from dominant cultural groups, don't even notice the injustice that's happening because they personally or their group are not experiencing those kinds of injustice. Then we have retributive and reparative justice, and it really is response to moral rule breaking, which affects the broader community and who else is included in that moral group who share the same moral codes. And so when that's violated, people feel that they want to have retributive or reparative justice there. The whole concept of moral exclusion, and the flip side would be inclusion, really talks about the scope of justice and what is included for people inside of your community. So it's sort of like an in-group, out-group concept, and that people who are not part of your moral code or your moral community are sometimes excluded from there. And the 6th type is cultural imperialism. And this is really universalizing the dominant culture's norms and practices and behaviors and values, and that people who are not from that dominant group feel as though there's cultural imperialism taking place because their culture is not being privileged. So how does this connect to conflict? Here's some implications there. And that perceived injustice is a frequent source of conflict, and people will have a variety of responses to that. When they feel that their sense of being in the world and that their justice is being violated, how they respond can be a variety of ways. And there are different processes and outcomes that are unjust, and then the resolution is unstable. So if the process of coming to a resolution is not just, is not fair, or sort of maybe even is coerced, then the resolution you come to is just not going to be sustainable, and it's going to be a very unstable resolution, and of course, very temporary. And then there's even conflict about what do we mean by just? What is just? What is a just world? What is justice? And I know that Greg's going to get into that a little bit more. And that blaming is inflaming. So sometimes groups tend to blame others for injustice, and then that just escalates conflict in different situations and can be inflaming. So this is just to set the context about the world of justice, but now Greg is going to take us on a different journey in looking at restorative justice as a way of dealing with conflict and so on. So Greg?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think that was a great introduction, especially in talking about some of the different types of justice that are out there, because I think what we've been seeing is a definite explosion in interest in this thing called restorative justice. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how we understand restorative justice, talk a little bit about its ideological foundations and the role that communication plays in it. And then as we talk about the role of communication, talk about how communication has really served to almost set the stage for two very different approaches to restorative justice. And then I want to end by talking about not only the implications of this framing of restorative justice, but kind of what this means for people involved in the work of restorative justice and people who are trying to facilitate its growth as we go down the line. So let me talk first about where we see restorative justice as a prelude to talking about what restorative justice is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So we've seen restorative justice as a concept really appear in a number of contexts. We see it frequently discussed in the criminal justice system, where we talk about practices or processes such as victim offender conferences, victim offender mediation, family group conferencing, and the like. We've seen this at the nation state level, especially in countries such as South Africa, Northern Ireland, where we are seeing truth and reconciliation commissions set up to bring about reconciliation after significant wrongdoing. As I mentioned a little bit, we've also seen restorative justice pop up in discussions about how to manage family conflict with these larger family group conferences. Schools have really been a ripe place for the growth of restorative justice. There is significant work around creating restorative schools or whole school restorative justice, in which schools are implementing certain processes like circles to combat problematic issues like bullying or different types of aggression. And we also see it discussed in the workplace as almost an alternative approach to dealing with rule breaking or policy violations, or even as other people have talked about, creating what's called the forgiving organization. So we see restorative justice pop up in a lot of contexts, and that actually brings us to a question of what is this thing called restorative justice? And I'm going to put an asterisk by that because there are several different conceptualizations about what restorative justice is. And in many cases, those conceptualizations are based on your pre-existing beliefs, your ideology, as well as the goals you're trying to accomplish. So as we look at some definitions here on the next slide, I think we can start to see some tensions that emerge in some of the different ways that people have defined restorative justice. So I want to highlight some of the ideological features as well as the instrumental features of 5 different definitions. And by no means are there only 5 definitions. There are many definitions of restorative justice. Here are just a few. For example, the Marshall 1999 definition is one that's been widely used, in which Marshall defines restorative justice as a process whereby parties with a stake in a specific offense collectively resolve how to deal with the aftermath of the offense and its implications for the future. So I think what you see there is a real focus on process and the collectivity of that process in working through an offense. Bazemore and Walgrave's definition is a little bit broader where they define restorative justice as every action that is primarily oriented toward doing justice by repairing the harm that has been caused by a crime. So again, you see it's being situated in the context of crime. You can go even broader by looking at Acton's definition as restorative justice being communication between those directly impacted by harm. In this definition, I think you see it, or restorative justice being situated not only within the criminal justice system, but in all settings where there could be harm that has occurred. McCold gives a more narrowly defined definition by specifying the characteristics that a restorative justice program has to have in involving victims, offenders, and their communities in face-to-face meetings where they determine the outcome. And then there's Zare and Micah's definition of it being a harm-centered approach that centers victims, the obligations of offenders, and the meaning of accountability, the role of the community, and the active engagement of all parties in the justice equations. So as we talk about some of the different definitions or conceptualizations of restorative justice, I want to talk a little bit about some of the tensions that we see in how we understand what restorative justice is. In many cases, there continues to be a debate or discussion about the relationship between restorative justice and, as Beth talked about earlier, retributive justice, what other people call conventional justice. The question is, are they dualistic opposites where one replaces the other, or are they compatible, right? So there are some folks who have defined restorative justice as the opposite. It is the exact opposite of retribution. Other people conceive of restorative justice as being just simply a different type of process rooted in different values, but can still be used alongside with or within the same process as conventional justice practices. So again, the question is, what is its relationship to our conventional understandings of what justice is? Another tension that we see in the literature is the extent to which definitions focus on process and or outcome. You saw some definitions that focus on both. Other definitions that focus primarily on the process, the collaborative, face-to-face nature of restorative justice work. And there are other definitions that focus on what needs to happen as a result, right? So what does healing look like? What does reparation and restoration look like? Probably the most intense, I guess if I use that word, debate that's going on right now is how narrowly or broadly, widely we should be conceiving of restorative justice. On the one hand, you have the more narrowly defined purist definitions, and these tend to be not only longer, but a lot more detailed in specifically outlining what restorative justice is and what restorative justice isn't. Then you see in other definitions, conceptualizations of restorative justice as being much broader, what people have described as being maximalist definitions. In other words, it's a really big tent, and there are lots of practices that might fall under the umbrella of restorative justice. For example, if we go back to the definitions that I presented earlier, we might look at McCold's definition as being a little closer to the purist or narrow definition of restorative justice. And we might look at Acton's and perhaps even Bazemore-Walgrave's definition as being closer to the maximalist or broader understanding, because they really broadly define what can fit under the umbrella of restorative justice. Now, of course, one of the reasons why all of these definitions differ is because they rest on different ideological foundations. So some people see harm in there being multiple definitions. We want one definition so that there can be a clear operationalization of what justice should look like. But as we know, concepts like justice and restoration are socially constructed, and of course they're going to vary based on context, based on history, based on a number of factors. For example, let me just present 3 different definitions of justice. Vandering defines justice as occurring when people are honored as human through relationships. Again, there's a lot to unpack in this definition. What does it mean to honor? What does it mean to be honored as human? What do those relationships look like? Waldron and Kelly define justice as the perception that one is treated fairly or equitably within a given system of rights, responsibilities, and moral values. We might tie this back to what Beth was talking about in the first slide. When we talk about procedural justice and distributive justice, there are other types of justice as well, including informational justice, interactional justice as well. So there are a lot of things going on here, but one of the key points of this definition that I would highlight is this notion of perception. Each of us is going to have likely very different perceptions of the same event, and so interpretation comes into play. Lederach defines justice as the pursuit of restoration, of rectifying wrongs, of creating right relationships based on equity and fairness. So I think what you begin to see here is that we can define justice in any number of ways. So when you combine that with the fact that we can define restoration in a number of ways, I think you begin to see where some of the fuzziness starts to emerge, right? So I've talked about restoration as the process of helping all the parties feel whole personally, materially, and possibly relationally, so that when someone experiences harm as a result of some type of offense, whether that occurs in a criminal case or whether it's a non-criminal event but it's still harmful, how do we help that person to feel whole, not only as a person, but also if they've lost something, whether it's money or objects materially, and if they want, potentially relationally as well. This is one of the big debates around the concept of forgiveness, does forgiveness necessitate reconciliation? In the West, we tend to distinguish those as being very separate events. You can forgive, but you don't necessarily have to reconcile. In other more collectivist cultures, they tend to see them as two sides of the same coin that naturally go hand in hand. So when we talk about restorative justice, we're not talking about some very easy to define concept. In fact, where most of the consensus has come is in terms of some underlying values of justice and restoration. So as we think about this, at least from an ideological perspective, you see some consensus on values like healing, and there are different dimensions of healing, of the value of moral learning. How do we learn what's right and what's wrong? And what do we learn as being what's right and what's wrong? How do we learn from our naturally, we're going to do these errors and mistakes, right? Values such as growth. All of us are in a state of becoming. We're all growing as humans from the point that we're born to the point that we die. How do we facilitate this growth in others? What does the concept of reparation look like, and how many dimensions does it have? Values such as empowerment and support. This springs from the idea that if you've been the victim of some harm, you have been disempowered. You have had some of your power stripped from you by the offender. How do we re-empower you by helping you to take control as opposed to having that control wrested from you? Perhaps we do this by supporting you, being there for you, and facilitating your conversation with the person who did some wrong or harm to you. And of course, this concept of fairness. And fairness not only as it applies to the outcome, but also fairness as it applies to the process, fairness as it applies to the information being presented, and fairness as it applies to the respectful treatment of one another. Right? And so this then takes us down to the next part about the process that we follow, involving meaningful stakeholder participation. If we look at conventional justice processes, the primary people who take the stage are attorneys and witnesses. For the most part, the accused and the victim don't necessarily take the stage or as center of a stage as other people. And yet, one of the underlying ideas of restorative justice is that the harm and the conflict that emerges from that harm belongs to the victim and the offender. So if it's their conflict and their harm, who are we to take the control of it away from them, right? So part of the empowerment process is encouraging meaningful stakeholder participation as long as it's safe and appropriate to do so. So in the restorative justice literature, there's always this discussion of when ethically is it appropriate to bring victims and offenders together? How do you make sure that people are prepared to sit face to face with someone who either they've wronged or who has wronged them, so that they can engage in this next part of respectful dialogue? And this doesn't mean that it's filled with platitudes, but it does mean that we're still treating the other person as being human. So this still allows for emotion, it allows for anger, for tears, and it allows for meaningful accountability that's still colored by this notion of respectfulness, of give and take, of back and forth, of listening, of recognizing, of helping to practice empathy, where you're trying to understand where the other person is coming from. So when we talk about these values, we talk about the different dimensions of justice and the different dimensions of restoration. I think one of the ideas that I've been centering on is this idea that we make restorative justice through our communication. So restorative justice just doesn't simply exist outside of us. It exists in the language that we use as we talk about it and as we practice it, right? So there are conventional understandings of communication. In the communication discipline, we call this the SMCR model, the sender, message, channel, receiver model, like a game of ping pong with you as the sender, the other person is the receiver, and the message that you're trying to get across is the ping pong ball, right? That's very nice and fluid and makes some sense, but it doesn't necessarily capture the way that we construct the world around us through our communication. So an alternative understanding of communication is what we might call a constitutive perspective. In other words, it says that the meanings that we have for things emerge through our conversation and evolve over time. We can think of words like sick, right? Sick in one context means that you're ailing. Sick in another context means that that's something that can be really cool. In other words, saying that's sick. It's the same symbol, but very different meanings attached to that same symbol. The idea is that meanings change over time, symbols change over time, and that as we communicate with one another, we are constantly managing those meanings, we're constantly dealing with tensions, we're constantly recreating this world through our communication. And that means we're recreating this notion of restorative justice through our communication. And so one of the arguments that I make is that when we talk about what restorative justice is, and we put these different tensions that I was talking about earlier on a pretty simplistic graph like this, I think you can situate proceduralist understandings of restorative justice. So I'm going to be talking about two different approaches to restorative justice: proceduralist approaches and structuralist approaches. This proceduralist approach kind of narrowly defines restorative justice. It perhaps might see it as a dualistic opposite from conventional justice, and it's definitely more focused on process. On the other hand, structuralists tend to be, tend to have a little wider conceptualization. Perhaps it's a little bit compatible, but it's definitely focused on the outcome, right? So how do we accomplish social change? Proceduralists tend to be a little bit more individualist minded, whereas structuralists tend to be a little bit more relational, or how do we change the social structures that underlie these social harms that have been created. So in the next couple slides, what I'd like to do is to dive into this proceduralist and structuralist idea a little bit more. For example, as I was talking about, your proceduralists tend to define restorative justice more narrowly, right? whereas your structuralists tend to take a more broader understanding about what is restorative justice. They might talk about, as I'll talk about here in a second, restorative practices instead. Proceduralists tend to focus on things like victim offender mediation, victim offender conferences, circles that are used in the court system, whereas your structuralists tend to focus on these restorative practices that can be used in a number of contexts to achieve social change. Your proceduralists tend to, because they narrowly define their idea of restorative justice, might tend to focus a little bit more on objective markers of effectiveness, like recidivism. Did the offender commit another crime? Reparation. Was the victim given reparation, material, personal, or otherwise, based on what they experienced? They might measure things like victim satisfaction, right? All of those are really tied to process-oriented approaches to restorative justice. Structuralists, on the other hand, because they more broadly define restorative justice, focus a little bit more on societal change. As I'll talk about here in a second, they talk a little bit more about notions of social justice rather than just simply individual justice. So there are greater emphases, especially in schools and in communities. We see this in people's work in economies and social welfare programs of how do we create a socially just community that is fair for all. So while the outcomes may not necessarily be tangible, what they do tend to focus on are the structural changes that they can create to ultimately create this more just society for everyone, right? Which takes us then to notions of harm and history and conceptualizations, again, of justice. So proceduralists tend to focus a little bit more on what I would call more your short-term harms, like your criminal violations, your bullyings, things like that that are more in the recent past. Whereas your structuralists, I think, tend to focus on more the historical harm. That's a concept that comes up repeatedly in some of the more recent restorative justice literature, is talking about historical harm and trying to restore people who are harmed currently because of those historical harms. Proceduralists, I would say that some modern approaches to restorative justice trace their history back to what's called the Kitchener experience, which occurred in Ontario back in the early 1980s, in which some boys who were charged with vandalism were taken door to door to apologize and make amends to their victims. We don't do that today for some good reasons, but it was an initial experiment, I think a good first step in trying to institute principles of restorative justice. Your structuralists tend to trace the history of restorative justice back much longer. They would situate restorative justice in indigenous people groups. So the Maori or some of the native groups here in the US. In other words, restorative justice isn't new. We've been doing this for as long as people have existed in groups. And I think you go from there, and it's not a far jump to say that your proceduralists tend to focus a little bit more on the individual nature of justice as being a process of finding solutions, repairing harm, accomplishing individual healing. Whereas your structuralists focus on broader values of equality, recognition, trust, connectedness, and balance. So these two different approaches actually have a number of implications, especially as we talk about legitimacy and support. So one thing that I really value as I see practitioners doing the work of restorative justice is trying to grow not only people's awareness of what restorative justice is, but also helping people to embrace it and see it as a legitimate approach to justice. So some questions that come out of this are, how do we know what people's attitudes are toward things like social justice and justice and crime? If we're going to do the work of expanding the work of restorative justice, we have to know what people's pre-existing attitudes are. I say that as kind of a social scientist. So if we're going to create messages that resonate with people, we have to make sure that we're giving the appropriate appeal. You can see this in the third bullet point, that will be most resonating with the audience that's listening. If I'm talking to someone for whom social justice really resonates, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the more structuralist approach. If I'm talking with someone who's more concerned about things like teaching kids a lesson and local control, I'm going to talk about this more from the proceduralist perspective, because I want my appeal to match with their existing attitudes, beliefs, and values. The next question then is, how do our appeals constitute what people think restorative justice is? I've done some work asking people what they think restorative justice is. Some people will just say the word restoration. Other people will, another person responded, it's a fuzzy kind of justice from the Obama administration. Other people will just call it justice. So the idea is run the gamut, right, of what people think this is. Other questions that I think have to be explored by researchers and practitioners. What isn't restorative justice? Especially if you're coming at this from a structuralist perspective. If you're taking a broader perspective of what restorative justice is there anything that doesn't count as restorative justice? Can we see multiple practices as being RJ, or restorative justice? Are certain practices restorative enough? And how do you effectively train restorative justice facilitators, right? Especially if this notion of what's effective is a little fuzzier than other conceptualizations, which of course brings us to the next question is, what exactly counts as being effective? In some interviews that my collaborator Ian Morten and I have done, we've asked people how they know that they're being effective. And some people will say, well, I know it because we have good measures of recidivism and satisfaction. So that's how I can go to my board and say, I've been effective. Other people who take a little bit more structuralist approach will say, well, I know it when I see it, and we're not there yet, but I can see that we're making progress because I can see the discussion changing about social justice in my community. So again, how do you know if what you're doing is being effective? So as we talk about the work of growing restorative justice, these are not only some of the tensions that we grapple with, but also some of the questions that I think it would be good for all of us, practitioners, researchers, and people who are just coming to the work of restorative justice, should be grappling with as we go forward. So that is the end of my presentation, and I look forward to answering questions and talking more about restorative justice and where this work is going.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. That was very informative. So as Greg and I just reflect a little bit on the presentation, I encourage you to put in comments and questions into the Q&A box that we will get to in a few minutes. So Greg, one of the things that struck me when you were speaking is that you come from the discipline of communication, and that's one of the main areas of interest and work that I do as well, although I don't consider myself a traditional communication discipline person. Mm-hmm. But I do a lot of work with coordinated management of meaning. And in CMM, there's a lot about communication and building relationships and meaning making and trying to make better social worlds. So some of what you were saying is how we say what we're saying and how justice or injustice comes out in our communication makes a big difference.
That's right. In fact, the person I was mentioning, Ian Morten, he and I have an article out in Negotiation Conflict Management Research Journal. Mm-hmm. That's published by International Association for Conflict Management. And it's a conceptual review of restorative justice. And in it, we actually draw on CMM to make the case that we shouldn't just be talking about communication as sender, message, channel, receiver, because it neglects the different ways that we make restorative justice what it is through our communication. And so as we use symbols like restorative justice, those symbols have different levels of meanings, right? So we have the situation level, we have the life script level, we have the collective level, and all the different levels that are involved in CMM. And so as we do the work of restorative justice, I think it behooves us to be mindful of how we're talking about restorative justice to different audiences.
Yeah, that's great. So do you remember when that article came out?
2017, I think it was.
Okay, I'm behind. So a couple of other things came to mind. So the whole idea about meaning making, and then I'm thinking about what happens crossing cultures and different value systems and different moral codes, right? So
right.
What one person might consider just, somebody else may consider unjust or may not even notice. And I was talking about earlier I think it was moral exclusion or retribution. I forgot which one I was talking about with what Morten had said also. Oh, maybe even the sense of injustice. So that some people say, can you believe that person did that? Or can you believe this is in place? Or can you believe? And other people are like, well, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? Because when you're part of the dominant culture, part of the dominant conversation, you don't necessarily notice in very innocent ways or very intentional ways that other things are happening around you. So considering the increase of diversity in the worlds we're living in and working in, how do we come to a shared understanding of what justice is, that we can even come to a shared understanding of restorative justice? It's a big question, and I'm just curious about some of your reflections on that.
Yeah, and this is something that I've grappled with not only as a researcher, but also as an administrator, right? So working in a workplace where you collaborate with people with very different life stories, very different beliefs that have emerged from those life stories. And when you have situations where, let's say, someone has done something that they shouldn't have done, even within a workplace setting, you have different people with different expectations of what should happen. Mm-hmm. So I think we've all worked with folks who, or interact with folks who say, well, you know what? You do the crime, you do the time, and you need to be ready to experience punishment. And if the consequence isn't rough enough, then it's not actually justice. And other people who have grown up saying, well, I don't know about that, because justice is something that is a matter of support. They just simply didn't know better. And to do justice, we have to help them to learn and know better. And punishment may not be the way to do it. So I think that's a roundabout way of saying that coming to a shared understanding is a process, right? Mm-hmm. And we always have to be dialoguing with one another. And in that dialogue, to be active, meaningful listeners. It doesn't necessarily mean that we change our stripes to match the other person, but it means trying to gather where they're coming from and understand. And I think that's part of some of the deficiencies that we see culturally right now is people go to their tribes and they surround themselves with people who agree with them. And when that happens, we stop exercising our dialogue muscle and start exercising our tricep muscles as we pat ourselves on the back, right? And so we cut off that dialogue that helps us to arrive at shared understandings of justice. And it's a real issue.
It's such an interesting concept of the dialogue muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it, right?
Yep, that's right.
So I'm thinking also you're doing a comparison a little bit between procedural and structural, and a couple of other things came to mind there too, in terms of like conflict resolution and dealing with conflict. So also I'm thinking about the initial like dispute that somebody might have, and then you address that at a surface level. But when you're looking at the structural part of it, which is much more systemic and historical, and there I'm also thinking about what Galtung wrote about structural violence, so that there are things built into the structure of our institutions and our systems and our practices that have become so ingrained into the fabric of how we operate and into our moral codes and so on, that it's much harder, much more complex and much harder to try to address, and does take a lot of time. And in general, I would say that a lot of people are not necessarily the most patient. And I know that in the US especially, we're not known for having a patient culture, which can look at things over a very long period of time. But any reflections on the whole idea about some of the initiatives that have been done towards addressing some of the more structural, systemic, deeper historical types of injustice?
Yeah, in fact, I'm thinking about some work that I'm doing right now, funded through the Kansas Department of Corrections. It's a project called Our Town, Our Kids, and it's happening in western and northwestern Kansas. And one of the things that we're focusing on is working with justice-involved youth. And we're focusing on things like not only trauma-informed care, but working with specialized populations and how those connect with communities. And one of the things that has emerged over the course of our study circles in these communities is that when we see kids who have touched the justice system, many times there are layers of poverty, there are layers of race, there are layers of just simply difference that sometimes connect. And there's some type of correlation. And some of it is the fact that these kids have grown up in horrific circumstances, and they have learned things from parents or friends or TV or whatever that they turn around and mimic. And so one of the questions that I think we're tempted to ask in the moment, because it's a short-term question, is, what's wrong with you and why did you do that, right? Whereas the more beneficial question is, what's happening here? And that question of what's happening allows you to surface stories and histories where you can go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that you had experienced all of those traumas in your life. I did not realize that you had experienced this other thing in your life. Now I understand why you've been acting the way you've been acting. It's still not okay to act that way, but now that I understand, now I can work with you to help develop better life habits. That's the very long view that I would say in the conventional justice system doesn't happen. It's you do the crime, you do the time, and sorry, you shouldn't have done it. You are personally responsible. But I think the work that we're doing in schools and in communities to address these social justice elements is vital, because they get at a lot of the factors that are invisible to us that drive wrongdoing.
So that's great. I look forward to hearing more about that as you progress in that project. Yeah. I'm thinking that our criminal justice system is not designed as being rehabilitative, so it's really just penal. Yes. In that way. So there are more programs in schools. I'm wondering, do you know, for example, that in teacher training programs, or I'm thinking in HR functions in organizations, I wonder, are there, or do you know of any kind of preparation that those kinds of educational or other kinds of preparatory programs, if they have anything towards developing more of a social justice orientation?
Gosh, I don't know. I would say here at Kansas State University, we have programming around social justice, and I believe some of it is rooted in our College of Education. And so students who are developing into being teachers have exposure to those social justice concepts. And I know we do this in our leadership communication doctoral program at K-State, is we also fold in these social justice elements as we talk through community engaged research and other things. So those are the two that I'm aware of. but that doesn't mean that there's not more. I know like in the Oakland School District, they're doing so much around restorative justice. And even in Wichita, Kansas, a lot of the schools have implemented this whole school restorative justice that has really helped reduce their incidence of out of school suspension and other things significantly.
Yeah, I was working on doing a monitoring and evaluation project of a restorative justice program that was implemented in 2 high schools as a pilot. And one of the things that came out of it, which we're just finalizing an article on this now, is that leadership, right? So leaders who have a stronger influence over the culture of any kind of an environment, such as a school, that they have a bigger influence, and that when leaders stand behind a restorative justice program or orientation, it's much more likely that that program is effective. If the principal, say the head of the school, says, yeah, this is important, and then doesn't do anything actively to support it. So for example, their schools have very full schedules. So students run from one place to another. Their days are very carefully programmed. So there's always something to do. So that means that if there isn't any other time built into the schedule to allow for these kinds of conversations, then typically they don't happen, because that means something else is not going to happen in order for these to happen. And of course, in the course of any day or any school year, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made about what is important and what gets priority and so on. But that speaks volumes to really the value of this initiative if there isn't any time allowed in the schedule. And that was one of the things that came out. And so leaders in organizations and schools as organizations, really set the tone and the culture of the organization as to whether it has this kind of an orientation or not.
Yeah, and as I think through some of the work going on in restorative justice, on the one hand, I kind of see this initiative of, well, I know it's right, I'm just simply going to do it regardless of what leaders and or elected officials, for example, say. And that's one approach. I don't know that it's going to get very far, but that's one approach. Another approach says, you know, I know this is right, and I think I need to get my leaders on board. So over in Salina, Kansas, they've had the Salina Initiative for Restorative Justice that has been effective at working with county attorneys and other folks in their justice system to implement these restorative processes. And they've enjoyed success because they've gotten their elected officials and other types of officials on board. So as we think through growth, I think it continues to be important for people to get not only their elected officials on board, but also to demonstrate what restorative justice looks like in sort of day-to-day life, so that there can be a mutual groundswell, both from the top and from the bottom, to implementing restorative justice. I see that in workplaces and in communities.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to a question that's being posed here. So for the last 5 years, I have been teaching classes in jail and prison. After working with almost 200 men who are incarcerated, I have started to think a lot about reentry. There are so many rituals that, in quotes, remove someone from the community, but not many or any rituals that, in quotes, return someone from the community. I have been developing this idea of creating some sort of ritual of return. I appreciated the point that understanding your audience helps to determine the message. Do you think this type of ritual would be more proceduralist or structuralist approach to RJ?
What a great question. And before I go further, really kudos to you for doing this work. I think that is fantastic work. And so, well, awesome, bravo. I would see, I guess it kind of depends, actually. So just from the text, I would say it's probably a little bit more proceduralist, because what sometimes happens is that we have these programs that exist within what I would call a more conventional community, right? And so just like the plants, the seeds that we plant in our soil, if the seed isn't planted in ripe enough soil, then, or appropriate soil, it's probably not going to produce as much fruit as we would hope. And so, like, I've been really wrestling with this question of ripeness for a while. Is how likely are these restorative programs going to be successful? How likely is it that they're going to be successful if the larger context in which they're operating doesn't necessarily share the same values as that program, right? So what's going to happen if we have these programs, for example, in jails and prisons, if the larger context isn't conducive to things like return or reentry rituals? Well, they may say, that's great, but if the larger structure in which those programs occur doesn't also echo those same values that underlie that process, we have to ask, well, how much support is it going to get, right? Because these programs rely on structural support. And of course, they rely on money. You got to have money, but money also comes from structural support. So I think a crucial question is, yes, we know that return rituals are just as vital, right? We talk about the role of ritual in everyday life. How do we create a larger system, what I call structure, that helps those types of rituals to be meaningful and impactful, right? I think that's part of the next question, and that's part of the larger framing to the administrators who run these jails, who run these prisons, right? Who kind of oversee the justice system. So some of the work that we've been doing in our town, our kids, has had to involve what are called our JCABs, our juvenile corrections advisory boards that are in these different communities, to make sure that they also are on board with and supportive of this work that we're doing. Because for this work that we're doing to really resonate and take root, we've got to make sure that the larger community in which it's operating is ripe. So how do we go about creating a ripe community for the work of restorative justice in our workplaces, where we live, in our schools, in our families, wherever?
Yeah, it's so interesting that it really does, they say, take a village, but it does take an integrated approach. And I know this, the whole idea about re-entry and reintegration into society is a really important one, and it's something that's local and global at the same time. I'm doing some projects in Colombia, and one of the big challenges they're facing right now is the reintegration of former FARC and paramilitary into the community. And these are communities of people who may have been like them in the past, or they may have suffered directly or indirectly from the violence. How do you really influence the mindset of the community to be open towards the reintegration process? So the question you have about ripeness is an interesting one too, and how forgiving or not forgiving our communities in being able to welcome back. Because one of the big issues I know in a lot of neighborhoods is, yes, we want services for certain kinds of populations, but the NIMBY, not in my backyard. So you can have these kinds of places, but just not next to where I live.
That's right. And we see this in workplaces especially. I mean, we think, how do workplaces define justice? Well, when you join an organization, more than likely you got a pretty thick employee handbook. And they laid out all the rules and regulations that you had to follow. And they laid out all the consequences that you're going to face if you don't follow them, whether it's a 3 strikes, whether it's a 1 strike, whatever it happens to be. And so if you're doing the work of restorative justice or trying to implement these restorative practices within the larger organization that is very conventional, well, how's that going to go over when you go to your administrator, or you go to your ombuds, or you go to whoever it is that's helping to manage this and say, okay, well, I want to hold this person accountable, but rather than just simply using the punishments that are outlined in the book, instead of using those, I want them to engage in face-to-face dialogue, and then the two of them, the person harmed and the person who did the harming, can work out what is the appropriate step that person can do to make the situation right. You can imagine that, especially in this litigation-friendly world of ours, that's automatically going to raise some alarms of going, I don't know about that. We don't have that process laid out in our books, right? So this requires a lot more in the way of relationship maintenance and sort of a willingness to let things emerge within boundaries, of course, but let things emerge as they do, rather than what I would call your conventional bureaucracy that has contingencies for every single potentiality.
Mm-hmm. Super. And one question I did not ask you is, how did you get involved in this field, the restorative justice world?
That's a great question. I accidentally stumbled into it while I was doing dissertation research. So I did my PhD and my master's and my undergrad at Texas A&M. So I had the opportunity to work with Linda Putnam, who, if that name rings a bell, you know how much she has influenced the world of conflict management and communication. And so I was doing dissertation research on practices of forgiveness in the workplace, because I was really fascinated by this question of how do people forgive? Why do people forgive? What happens when people forgive, especially in workplaces that are conventionally very impersonal? And so I'm doing just some background reading, and lo and behold, I come across an article by Deborah Kidder. I think it's called Not Rights, but the Right Way to Restore Justice in the Workplace. And that was the first time I came across the concept of restorative justice. And her description of it resonated deeply with me. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I've been looking for some time. And then, of course, that distracted me from the other work that I needed to be doing on my dissertation, because I then started looking for everything that I could find about restorative justice. And I thought, this is where I want to take my research. And so when I moved up to Pennsylvania, I started working at Millersville University. I got involved in an organization up there. At the time, it was called the Lancaster Area Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. Now it's called ADVOZ, A-D-V-O-Z. And I was trained as a facilitator. They did a great job of training. And then I got involved as a facilitator and then a trainer. And then I started doing some of my research up there on how do facilitators do this work of restorative justice. And then as I moved to Kansas State University about 6.5 years ago, I got interested in this question of growing the work of restorative justice. And using some of my social science background to ask, well, really, what are people's attitudes, and how do we construct messages that resonate with those attitudes? And how do we evaluate what makes an effective restorative justice program? And so I've been doing that work for a while, and there's another group down here in Kansas. It's called Restorative Kansas, I believe it is. And we did a conference last year that drew, I think it was about 70 to 100 people in Kansas. We're doing another one next calendar year, so in 2020, that looks at the role of restorative justice in Kansas in the work. So it's been really interesting to me, and I've really enjoyed the work.
Wow, that's a great story. So we're almost out of time now. So anything you'd like to add in closing?
Well, number one, I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this. And I think number two, I would say that this is a long-term work, right? So as you think through not only your own attitudes toward restorative justice, but also your own attitudes toward justice in general, I think restorative justice has an opportunity, or there's an opportunity to really invest in people's lives. And the question for all of us is, are we ready and willing to invest in people's long-term growth and to play a role in creating situations that are ripe for things like dialogue and empathy. And so those are the questions that continue to motivate me, not only as a researcher, but also as an engaged researcher who is working with communities to create these communities of dialogue and restoration. So those are the things that keep me going, and I hope that the folks listening are also asking questions about what is it that keeps them going, and what are the things that make them drawn to the work of conflict resolution and restorative justice.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I'm just going to turn it back now to Ileana.
Thank you both for that amazing presentation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to everyone for participating in today's webinar this afternoon. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and it will be made available to you online. If you have any other questions about the MS in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution offered at Columbia's SPS, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to provide you with any additional information you may need. Again, we want to thank our presenters and all of you, and we hope you have an amazing rest of your day.